The Symbol of Avarice, an armor piece that increases soul gain and item discovery when you wear it. Sounds pretty great, right? But it comes at a cost. You lose 10 health every second you wear it. Now this may not sound like a lot, and honestly, it isn't actually too hard to work around if you really want to wear it all the time. You just gotta heal yourself every once in a while. But what if you couldn't heal? The clock would always be ticking. With every second, you would come closer and closer to an inevitable death, and every hit you took from an enemy would only accelerate this process. Now that's a challenge, and one I was eager to take on. Hello everyone, this is Salty Sev, and today I'm going to be telling you how I beat Dark Souls 3 while always wearing a Mimic Head and never healing. Before we get into it, let's quickly go over the rules that I made for this challenge run. First, I must always wear a Mimic Head, from the moment the game starts till the very end of the run. This is pretty self-explanatory and forms the basis for the run. Secondly, I am not allowed to use any form of direct healing. This includes Estus, Siegbrow, Divine Blessings, and any and all miracles. I can, however, equip items that give me passive health regen, which include the Ethereal Oak Shield, the Sun Princess Ring, and a Blessed Infused Weapon. With all of these items, I can get at most 6 health per second of health regen, which I won't even be able to get until pretty far into the run anyways. So, best case scenario, even at the end of the run, I'll still be losing at least 4 health per second. I still liked allowing this though, as it added some form of strategy and progression to the challenge. Finally, the run isn't complete until I've defeated every single boss, including the DLCs. This just boils down to personal preference. I could have just as easily considered the run complete after beating Cinder. So with all the rules laid out, I have one more thing to say before we get started. This video took quite a while to make, with all the recording, editing, script writing, and so much more that goes into each challenge run. So if you end up enjoying, leave a like. And if you want to see more challenge runs like this in the future, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out. I'm always working on a few different challenge runs at any given time, but if you think of any that you think would be interesting or cool to see, be sure to let me know in the comments section. Anyways, with all that out of the way, let's get into the run. I hope you enjoy. I started by picking the warrior class since it has the highest starting HP, which in hindsight may have been a huge mistake, but we'll get into that later. I also obviously chose the life ring as my starting item, since it'll give us just a little more time before the Mimic Head saps all of our life away. Of course, I spent some time crafting my absolutely beautiful face before covering it up forever with a massive chest. And by massive chest, I mean the Mimic Head. I know what you were thinking. Then I start the game, and, magically, a Symbol of Avarice appears in my inventory. I put it on, start losing health, and the run has officially begun. I proceed to run past literally every enemy and go straight to the first bonfire. I take a quick break to catch my breath, then head over to the first boss I'd have to take on in this challenge, Iudex Gundyr. Now, I honestly didn't really know what to expect going into this. I've beaten the game plenty of times, so Gundyr was usually pretty easy for me at this point. But this was different. I couldn't make any mistakes. Even with the highest starting HP and the life ring, I could only survive 55 seconds before dying. 55 seconds from the moment I leave the bonfire to killing Gundyr. And that was if I didn't get hit at all. One touch, one tap of his little halberd, and it was over. So I knew what had to be done, and I just went for it. And as it turns out, it was actually kinda easy. After having fought Iudex Gundyr and Champion Gundyr countless times in the past, dodging the tutorial boss's ultra slow attacks was surprisingly easy. And just like that, I beat Gundyr and was getting ready to head to Firelink Shrine to cash in those juicy boss souls. But then I died. Before I could even light the bonfire in Gundyr's arena, my greed and lust for power was already overcoming me. And this was going to be a fairly common theme in this run, constantly in a never-ending race against my avarice, and more times than not being dragged down by my covetous endeavors. But I digress. For now, I was blind to the pain and suffering that my future would hold. For now, I was riding the high of achieving such an easy victory, so I ran back, grabbed my souls, and sprinted to Firelink Shrine, where I immediately put all my points into Vigor. Now, I haven't talked much about my build so far, but in short, my goal was to put all my points into Vigor and Strength early, and then transition via Rosaria to a faith-based build once I could start rocking a Blessed Weapon for that sweet health regen. Later on, once I got to some of the tougher bosses in the DLC, I eventually ended up switching my build up to get more damage, but we'll get to that later. Next, I made my way to Highwall, where I began to learn just how painful this run was going to be. See, in my planning for this challenge, all I'd really been worrying about was boss fights and having enough health and damage to get through them. But what I really should have been concerned with was the disgustingly long runs from bonfire to bonfire that I'd have to make before each boss. And I immediately got a taste of this quite early as I tried to make my way from the Tower on the Wall bonfire just to get the shortcut elevator to Vort. Going into this area, I thought to myself, well, I just got a lot more health. I have plenty of time to get this shortcut, right? Wrong. The path to get this shortcut either involved falling down a few rooftops and dodging a massive winged fucker, or taking 20 years navigating the area and sliding down a series of ladders at an extremely slow pace. So, obviously, my decision was to go for the rooftop method, which didn't work. Don't get me wrong, I got close, but the fall damage from dropping down from each rooftop was just adding up far too quickly. After dying a few dozen times as I threw myself down these buildings over and over again, I began to contemplate some things. Why I was doing this? What I'd done in my life to deserve this self-induced hell? Was this even possible? And then, a chilling thought that haunts me to this day. Hey, I'm really taking a lot of fall damage here. Isn't there a spell for that? And then it hit me. Remember earlier when I said I may have made a mistake when I chose the warrior as my starting class? Well, I did. Probably. When I was choosing my starting class, I focused mainly on the Vigor stat and pretty much nothing else. And I didn't have to look far. The warrior starts with a whopping 14 Vigor and bolsters some good damage to back it up. Because of this, I completely overlooked the assassin, who I now believe would have been a much better choice. While the assassin starts with significantly less HP, it has access to the spell Spook, which negates any non-lethal fall damage. Yup, a spell that completely trivializes the few big drops that stood between me and Vort, and I've been blinded by the warrior's juicy health stat and shiny pecs. After making this divine revelation, I was at a loss. Do I restart just for Spook? Would I even have the damage to beat Gundyr fast enough if I did? Well, being the stubborn asshat that I am, I just chose to push through and level up my Vigor a few more times till I could just barely get the shortcut. I was finally able to take on Vort, which, like Gundyr, was surprisingly easy. While it was a close call that once again killed me right as I won, it only took a few tries. After that, it was smooth sailing through the undead settlement. For now, I chose to skip the curse-rotted Greatwood till a little later when I had more health and damage. Next up was the Road of Sacrifices, where I was at a crossroads and had an important decision to make. I could either take on the Crystal Sage and head into the Cathedral of the Deep, or I could make my way through Farron Swamp and attempt the Abyss Watchers. Well, the poison-filled nightmare that is Farron Swamp absolutely terrified me, so I chose the Cathedral route. Not only would this give me access to the Painted World, where I could get the Ethereal Oak Shield, it would also allow me to get a Blessed Gem, which would become very important later on. So I made my way over to the Crystal Sage, expecting another easy boss fight, but I could not have been more wrong. The Crystal Sage quickly became one of the most infuriating fights I'd ever had to do in a challenge run. While it took under 30 actual attempts to take him down, the pain and frustration that went into those 30 attempts, and the deaths along the route to his boss room, is immeasurable. And I'm not saying the Crystal Sage is a difficult boss. He can be a little tricky on your first few playthroughs, but once you figure out how to predict where he'll reappear each time he teleports, it isn't too hard. However, in this challenge, things were different. Without being able to heal off any attacks, being hit by a single spell marked an almost certain death. What's worse, every time the Sage decided to disappear for a few moments before teleporting across the map, I'd have no choice but to helplessly sit there and watch my health slowly drain away. And that's not all. It wasn't just the Crystal Sage. His little sorcerer pals that stood guarding his boss room also loved to just spam the shit out of me with spells. But I didn't care. The insatiable desire I felt for his juicy souls and the lucrative healing opportunities just past him overcame any internal rage that this bullshit may have instilled within me, and I pushed forward. I threw myself at him over and over until I finally came out on top. After that, I quickly made my way into the cathedral, grabbed the blessed gem inside, lit the bonfire in Rosaria's chamber, then talked to Gale to take a brief trip into the DLC. You see, in Ashes of Ariandel, I could pick up the first item that would start giving me a little health regen, the Ethereal Oak Shield. I just had to dodge around some ice doggos and some fat Vikings, and the shield was mine. And just like that, I had 2 health regen per second. So, now only losing 8 health per second, I felt ready to head into the dreaded Farron Swamp. Now, I'm gonna be honest here, I went through that swamp as fast as humanly possible. Before I knew it, I found myself in front of the massive door leading to the Legion of Edgelords, who are more formally known as the Abyss Watchers. Now this fight, much like the Crystal Sage, took quite a while to overcome. But unlike the Crystal Sage, this fight was not nearly as bullshitty and infuriating. Yes, the gank squad made things pretty annoying at times, but I didn't have to watch the boss endlessly teleport across the map and shoot soul spears up my ass every time I got near him. And more importantly, I could backstab this boss, a mechanic which I found to be extremely useful in this challenge. Not only do backstabs give me iframes, but they momentarily stop the Mimic Head health drain until the animation ends. This was huge. I could dodge around the main Abyss Watcher, initiate a backstab, then sit back and relax for a few seconds while his gank buddies could do nothing but watch as I pummeled their angsty leader. It took quite a few attempts to fully realize how I could take advantage of the interaction between backstabs and health drain, but once I did, things became a lot easier. Before I knew it, I was consistently getting to phase 2, and once I got there, victory was only a few backstabs away. Soon enough, I defeated my first Lord of Cinder, and my incessant greed was starting to pay off as the souls just kept stacking up. I used my newfound wealth to level up a few more times, then quickly made my way into the Catacombs of Karthus, where I proceeded to run past every enemy I encountered, and headed straight to Wolnir. High Lord Wolnir is a very gimmicky boss, and as such, I was pretty confident going into this fight. All I had to do was break his 3 dollar store knockoff gold bracelets, and I'd be able to enter Irithyll and finally get one of the main weapons for this run, the Dragon Slayer's Axe. With that beautiful prize clouding my every thought, I ran headfirst into the Wolnir fight, expecting an easy victory. It was not. Now, Wolnir wasn't as technical as the Abyss Watchers. Dodging his attacks wasn't very challenging. But what was challenging was actually getting to his sorry excuses for jewelry that he held on his scrawny little forearms. If I touched, even for a second, the ominous smoke that enshrouded his lower body, I could say goodbye to every hope of winning, cause that shit was a death sentence. And don't even get me started on his little habit of blowing smoke all over the battlefield. The reminder of Wolnir's crippling vape addiction also marked an assured destruction. At first, I thought I might actually get stuck on this guy for a while, but then... Oh my god. Let's go! We actually did it! No fucking way! Please tell me that counted. I'm not embered. Oh my god. Please. I gotta go see. Fuck. I don't think we did it. Damn it. I was heartbroken. Sure, my insatiable greed had killed me right after killing bosses before, but it was always late enough after that the game would still count the kill. After that, I was a broken man. I once again started to question everything. Had this all been a mistake? Had my incessant lust for power and souls blinded me from seeing the monster that I was becoming? Hell no! I made my way back to Wolnir and literally beat him on the very next attempt, as if the universe itself was explicitly affirming my sinful self-indulgence. Anyways, with Wolnir defeated, I set my eyes on Irithyll, and what a view it was. Except I couldn't enter Irithyll since I hadn't gotten the doll from the deacons yet, so I made a quick trip to go take them down. In the process, I suddenly remembered that I still hadn't killed the curse-rotted Greatwood, so I took her out as well, then headed back to Irithyll and made my way across the bridge. Still emboldened by the realization I had made after defeating Wolnir, I began to plow my way through a significant portion of the run. I knocked Creighton around a couple times and got the Dragon Slayer's axe, slapped on some gloves and smacked the shit out of Pontiff, and poured salt all over the ugly half of Aldrich. After beating Aldrich, I got access to Guinevere's room from DS1. But unfortunately, Guinevere was gone, so I had to make do with what she'd left behind, the Sun Princess ring. This gave me an additional 2 health regen per second, bringing the total health drain from the Mimic Head down to only 6 health per second. I then made my way into Irithyll Dungeon, which I'd have to get through to fight the next major boss, Yorm the Giant. Although I was absolutely blasting through the game at this point, seemingly unstoppable, I began to doubt my ability to make it through the dungeon. You see, not only was the route through the dungeon painstakingly long and difficult, but it was filled with jailers who could easily lower my health just by looking at me. And not just by a little either. They could easily reduce my health to almost nothing in the blink of an eye. This was terrifying. Once again, I began to lose hope. It looked like my stroke of good fortune had run its course, and I began to doubt if it was even possible to get through Irithyll Dungeon without succumbing to the chest. Just as I was getting ready to resign myself to a life of poverty and misfortune, something quite unexpected happened. I was watching a no-hit runner on Twitch and noticed they had a quite peculiar way of getting through the dungeon unscathed. You see, while making your way through the dungeon, you briefly walk through an exposed part of the dungeon, from which you can see the entrance to the profane capital. Now, most people that have played Dark Souls 3 probably know this, but what they might not know is that if you jump from a particular ledge, from a particular spot, facing a particular way, you can land on a railing at the bottom that is just barely close enough that you won't die from fall damage. And that railing you land on just so happens to be the walkway that brings you into the profane capital, effectively allowing you to completely skip the dungeon. Suddenly, there was hope. It was undoubtedly a difficult skip to perform, but I had nothing to lose. I threw on the cat ring, made my way over to the ledge, lined myself up like I knew what I was doing, and jumped. And I missed and fell to my death. Feeling a little defeated, I decided to give it another go, and I got it, on my second try. It's like once again the universe was affirming that my excessive greed was not misguided, and that I was truly destined for greatness. With my blinding overconfidence restored, I booked it to Yorm's arena, knowing he didn't stand a chance. Out of all the bosses I'd faced, this was by far the easiest. Knowing the gimmick to the fight, it was a cakewalk, and I easily took him down in my first attempt. Okay, so maybe I let my guard down on the first try, but I got it this time. Okay, so maybe I let him dunk on me a few times just to cheer him up, but you all know how the saying goes, third time's a charm. Except it wasn't, but it was on the fourth time. Before I knew it, I was being teleported back to Highwall to fight the Dancer. After dying an embarrassing amount of times on the previous boss, I wasn't going to underestimate this one. But I had nothing to worry about. I was once again on a roll. After a few initial deaths to the Dancer, I took her down without too much difficulty. I then proceeded to absolutely roll Osiris and bully the shit out of Champion Gundyr. Everything was going well until I reached the end of Lothric Castle and ran into the next big boss and wall of the run, Dragon Slayer Armor. This possessed suit of armor with giant butterfly buddies would prove to be quite a challenge. Not only did it have a shitload of HP, but it hit like a fucking truck. So in this fight, I had to tread very carefully. One mistake, and I'd lose half my health, or more. What's worse, since the Dragon Slayer armor resisted lightning damage, my Dragon Slayer axe felt practically useless. So I'd have to pretty much get through this fight hitless to come up victorious. I died quite a bit, and even began considering switching to a different build entirely just to get more damage. Thankfully, I was eventually able to come out on top. After defeating Dragon Slayer armor, I made my way through the Grand Archives with little to no difficulty. While I really struggled getting through a lot of the early areas in this run, now that I had a decent amount of health, I rarely ran into any problems. At the very top of Lothric Castle, I encountered the last Lord of Cinder I'd need to take down, the Twin Princes. I knew their movesets pretty well by this point though, so they posed little challenge, and I took them down after only a handful of tries. And with that, I was ready to move on to the DLC. Except, I had a few loose ends to tie up first. The first of which was the old Demon King. But before I could do that, I decided to switch my build up. The 2 health regen per second from the Blessed Axe was pretty nice, but it really hindered my damage potential. I couldn't buff the weapon, and the faith scaling only went so far. Knowing the upcoming DLC bosses would be significantly harder than what I'd faced previously, I decided to switch to a dex build using the Sellsword Twin Blades, which is one of the most potent weapons in the entire game. I was initially worried that this switch would make things too easy, but I was dead wrong. While missing out on 2 health regen per second might not sound like much, it's actually pretty significant when you take into account how little damage I was taking before. The jump from taking 4 damage per second to 6 damage per second is a whopping 50% increase. With some pretty basic math, you can see that the max amount of time I can survive before the Mimic Head kills me dropped by a very significant 33%. So despite doing more damage with the Wind Blades, the reduced health regen meant that I was on a much shorter timer for every fight. The challenge, by no stretch of the imagination, had become easy. Well, except for old Demon King. He was about as challenging as pressing the L1 button on my controller a few times. After taking down the old Demon King, I began a mini boss rush of sorts. Before switching up builds, I'd actually gone into both of the DLCs and made my way to the bonfires before each of the upcoming bosses. So now, all that was left was the small task of killing them all. I decided to start with the Nameless King up at Archdragon Peak. On the way, I took down the Ancient Wyvern with a fun little cheese you can do by jump attacking his head from an elevated ledge. Anyways, I took down Nameless King with surprisingly little difficulty. I usually struggle with the various combos of quick swipes and stabs that he throws out, but on this day I was just locked in for some reason. I felt like Neo in the Matrix. It was like I could see each one of his attacks moments before they came out. Needless to say, it only took me a few tries to take him down. I wish I could say the same for the next few bosses I took on over in the first DLC, the Ashes of Ariandel. The first I faced was the Gravetender duo, also known as the Champions Gravetender and Gravetender Greatwolf. While this fight rarely poses a problem in regular playthroughs, in this challenge it was absurdly ridiculous. The fight starts out with you taking on Champion's Gravetender, along with a few of his wolf buddies. The Gravetender is quite different from other bosses, however, having the model of an NPC, using a much smaller and faster weapon than most bosses, and being able to dodge your attacks. NPC-like enemies in the Dark Souls games pose a unique challenge in that they often attack much faster and are a lot more mobile than most bosses. This will be a common theme with the few NPC-like bosses and enemies I fought in this run. As such, I really struggled with this boss. The Gravetender had a wide variety of quick and deadly attacks he could use, when he wasn't too busy hiding behind his puny little shield, that is. What's worse, after getting him down to about half health, he calls for his loyal companion, the Gravetender Greatwolf, to come gank the shit out of you. So my main strategy for this fight was to just rush down the Gravetender as fast as possible before he could call in the Greatwolf. This would allow me to fight both of them one-on-one, which was much easier to handle. I died quite a bit to these guys, but eventually emerged victorious. The deaths of the Gravetender duo would mark a significant turning point in this run. The difficulty had already been rapidly increasing over the past few bosses, but things were about to go to a whole new level of difficulty. The rest of the bosses I'd need to defeat to complete the run would easily prove to be substantially more difficult than any of the others I'd previously encountered. Not only did they all do an absurd amount of damage, they also all had multiple phases and large health pools, leading to long, drawn-out fights in which I'd have to make little to no errors to come out on top. The first of these was the infamous 3-phase Sister Fried fight. In the first phase, you fight Sister Fried with a relatively basic moveset consisting of various scythe swipes and slams. In the second phase, Father Ariandel joins the fight and tries to smash you with his burning hot soup bowl. And in the final phase, you fight solely Fried again, except this time she has a much larger arsenal of attacks and combos to smack the shit out of you with. This is by far the hardest phase of the fight, and can be particularly daunting to face after getting through the first two. Now, I thought I'd already mastered this boss when I beat them on my first Soul Level 1 run, but that could not have been further from the truth. While the first phase was still relatively easy for me, the second phase is where I started to run into problems. If I didn't get through this phase, and the first, without taking any hits, I'd have no chance at beating the third phase, so I had to play perfectly. Now, if I had all the time in the world, then sure, that wouldn't be the craziest thing to do, but I didn't. The clock was always ticking. Any hesitation or attempts to take it slow would leave me with an insufficient amount of health to get through Phase 3, so I'd need one hell of a strategy if I wanted to win. Except the strategy I ended up employing, and what ended up working, wasn't much of a strategy at all. Since I know I could pretty easily get through the first phase without getting hit, I could play ultra aggressive in the second phase with little to no repercussions. Sure, I may not have made it to Phase 3 as consistently, but when I did, I'd have much more health than if I'd taken my time and played it safe. This allowed me to slow down and play much more intelligently in the third phase, which was absolutely necessary. After a few hours of attempts, and a few painfully close deaths at the very last second, I finally took her down. And with that, I was done with the Ashes of Ariandel, and was ready to move on to the Ring City. But before I could enter the Ring City, I had one tiny little obstacle standing in my way: the Demon Prince. Like Freed, this would be another long, multi-phase fight, but with a few key differences. In the first phase, you'd simultaneously fight the Demon in Pain and the Demon from below. After taking both of them out, the last one you killed would, after a short period of waiting, transform into the Demon Prince, who has both a shit ton of health and resistances. So this fight was tough. Luckily, I could pretty quickly get through the first phase just by spamming with the Wind Blades, but would often still get smacked around by the Demon Prince. Much like the Freed fight, however, since I know I could somewhat easily get through the first phase, I played hyper aggressive on the second phase. It was still quite a struggle though, and I just barely was able to take down the Demon Prince in one of the closest fights I'd had since I died to Wolnir much earlier in the run. This was a startling sign that, just like in the very beginning of the run, I didn't have much extra health to work with, so I'd need to play pretty optimally to succeed. After entering the Ring City, I made my way to the next boss, which was Halflight, Spear of the Church. This was by far the most infuriating, bullshit-ridden boss in the entire run. For the sake of consistency, I fought in offline mode, but man was it brutal. It's like this fight was designed just to screw me over. Being an NPC-like enemy, Halflight attacks and dodges extremely fast, so getting hits in was very difficult. More importantly, he has assistants in the form of Painting Guardians that are spawned twice during the fight, once before he's initially summoned, and again when he gets to a little above half health. Not only would these stupid fuckers spam boomerangs at me, they'd also heal Halflight, making them insanely tedious to deal with. After many attempts, many deaths, I finally devised a strategy. First, I would backstab and quickly finish off the Painting Guardian that spawned in before Halflight. I'd then hit exactly 5 lightning buffed running R1s on Halflight, which would get him right above the health threshold for spawning the second Guardian. Then, I'd chill for a bit until my health fell below 20%, which would proc the red Tearstone ring, boosting my damage significantly. Finally, I'd wait for an opening after one of Halflight's attacks and then try to initiate a stun-locking combo on him to try to burst him down before the second Painting Guardian could spawn. This strategy was adapted from one used in many no-hit runs, which I specifically learned about from a video by SquillaKilla, which I'll link in the description. There were still 2 main problems with this strategy that, though it was a viable strategy in no-hit runs, still made it insanely difficult in this challenge. First, being able to start the combo before Halflight could slice the shit out of me with his saber was extremely difficult and required the utmost precision or I'd instantly die. Second, and more importantly, if I did manage to start the combo, I'd still run out of stamina before killing him, necessitating a couple follow-up attacks, which were very, very risky. Not only was I below 20% HP and capable of being one-shot, but there was also now a Painting Guardian charging and spamming projectiles at me. I had a few very close calls that left me absolutely seething with anger, and after a while I started regularly using embers before the fight. Just to be clear, I would always use it at the bonfire before I left, so that I effectively wasn't healing myself, but only increasing my max health. I could have just as easily pumped a bunch of levels into Vigor, but I'd much rather spend my time taking on these tougher bosses than doing mindless grinding. At this point, I was at my breaking point. It felt impossible. I knew I'd come so close already, but it still felt just out of reach. And so, for a bit, I put the challenge on hold. Classes were starting up again at my college, and this became an easy excuse to put the game down for a while. But after a few weeks, things changed. I was just chilling in my room one night doing homework when suddenly, out of nowhere, I felt something. Ever so slight, almost unnoticeable, but still present. I could feel them calling. The souls, the beautiful, succulent souls. And the pride of beating such a run. My God, was it alluring. And it didn't stop there. What was once a whisper gradually escalated, minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, until it was all I could think about. Before I knew it, I found myself booting up Dark Souls 3 and throwing myself right back into the flames. And this time, there was no backing down. To think I could just give up when I'd already come so far, and was so close to the ultimate victory? Pure foolishness. And so I threw myself at this boss, relentlessly, until I finally pulled it off. And it didn't even feel good. There was no bliss or feeling of accomplishment, just relief at the knowledge I'd never have to fight such a shitty boss like that ever again. So, with all 3 of the remaining bosses now within access, I had my choice of who I'd take on next. In the end, I chose to take on Old Uncle Gale first. While he proved to be tremendously difficult, it felt fair and was a welcome change from the nightmare that was Halflight. There wasn't much strategy that went into this fight besides timing my buffs. I'd start the fight with a lightning buff, slice him up till he staggered once, then apply a poison buff. This would allow me to just proc the poison on him right as phase 2 was about to start. Having Gale poisoned after phase 1 made the rest of the fight just a bit easier, and it allowed me to just barely have enough health to take him down without dying. I then made my way to a secret passage that took me to the second to the last boss of the challenge, the infamous Dark Eater Midear. Being known as one of the toughest bosses in the entire game, perhaps even the entire series, you might think he'd pose another significant challenge, but he was surprisingly easy. Once you properly know how and where to attack him, mainly by staying right in front of him, the fight becomes much easier. I still expected to be stuck on him for a little while though, seeing as how much health he has, but my wind blades absolutely shredded through the Dark Dragon. I was able to take him down on my very first try, and I was hyped. Once again filled with confidence from my recent victories, I made my way to the only thing standing in between me and the ultimate satisfaction of completing the run, Soul of Cinder. Being the final boss of the game, he could be somewhat underwhelming compared to many of the DLC bosses, but he is infamously difficult to face when you can't afford to get hit. The fact that he has 5 different movesets throughout the various phases of the fight makes him a much more complicated boss to master than most. As such, I struggled quite a bit with this guy. My method of playing hyper-aggressive just wasn't working. I wasn't familiar enough with his moveset. It took a while, but I was eventually able to get confident enough with the sword phase that he starts out in that I could play pretty aggressively. If I could get through most of his phase 1 health bar before he switched weapons for the first time, I'd only have to dodge a few more attacks and then I'd be in phase 2. Once I got there, my main strategy was to play as passively as my ever-shrinking health bar would allow, and focus mainly on punishing his jump and lightning attacks. While it felt impossible, just knowing that he was all that stood between me and victory gave me the strength to persist, and I eventually took him down. Here's my final build and the stats that I ended up with. And just like that, the run was over. Well, almost over. I still had to initiate the ending sequence and get one of 3 possible endings. Being driven by the greed and lust for power that was granted to me by the Mimic Head, I of course chose the Usurper of Flame ending, where I would harness the power of the flame itself. After traveling back to Firelink Shrine one final time to talk to Yuria and make sure things were all set, I made my way back to the Kiln of the First Flame and initiated the final cutscene. Finally, I was seeing the fruits of my labor. After so much hardship and struggle, I, and I alone, was the most powerful being alive. I basked in the glory and admiration that I received from my hollow underlings, as I prepared to harness the mantle of ruler. And then I found myself right back in Firelink Shrine, like nothing had happened. What about my fame, my glory? I had just usurped the flame itself. I was to be the ruler of the world. And yet, here I was. In this sobering moment, I suddenly decided to take off the Mimic Head. The challenge run was over. I didn't have to wear it anymore. And then it all hit me. The full gravity of the situation. The person I'd become when I put on the chest. Blinded by my hubris and my insatiable lust for power, I'd let it completely consume my every waking thought and action. All the friends I'd left behind on my journey, I'd never be able to get back. And at the end of it all, what was it for? What did I get out of it? I'd achieved everything, gotten the souls of the greatest beings in the world, assumed the power of the flame itself, and yet I still felt empty. Only after removing the chest did I realize the error in my ways. So what now? Should I just take the chest off forever and try to go back to living a normal life? Was that even possible? Or should I just embrace the Mimic Head and continue on my avarice-driven rampage on a never-ending quest to gather souls? The ever-alluring pull I felt with the Mimic Head on had become such a common comfort that I could barely imagine a world without it. And so I stood at the precipice of my journey, pondering what would come of my future.